In the fall of 1878, along the jagged coast of Maine, there existed whispers of a hunger that could not be sated by bread or salt pork alone. It was a famine of the spirit, a quiet desperation that clung to the salt-sprayed fishing villages like the perennial fog. This is the story of two sisters who arrived on the tide of that unspoken need, offering a strange and singular nourishment. They carried with them a recipe, not written in a book, but carried in memory, a stew that promised to feed the hollows of the soul. But in feeding the forgotten hungers of the town, they awakened a darkness that learned to crave more than just a meal, proving that some services come at a cost too steep to be paid. If you find yourself drawn to the shadowed corners of history, and this is your first visit to our archive, consider subscribing to ensure you do not miss the uncovering of what lies buried. The town of Port Blossom was less a place of intention and more one of resignation. It had been carved into the unforgiving granite shoreline generations prior, a hopeful outpost that had long since surrendered to the elements. Its clapboard houses, once painted in optimistic whites and blues, had been scoured by relentless, salt-heavy winds to a uniform, melancholy gray. Shingles curled like dried leaves, and widows' walks sagged under the weight of perpetual dampness, their gazes fixed on a sea that gave and took in equal, brutal measure. The air itself was a thick, wet blanket, carrying the mingled scents of low tide, decaying fish, and the sweet, cloying rot of seaweed baking on the stony beaches. The streets were not paved, but were instead paths of compacted mud and crushed oyster shells that glimmered with a faint, spectral luminescence in the weak afternoon light. On most days, a dense fog rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the town whole, muffling sound until the tolling of the chapel bell or the cry of a distant gull seemed to come from another world entirely. This was a place where conversations were kept short, where men moved with the stoic, rolling gait of those long accustomed to unsteady decks, and where women's faces seemed etched with the same lines of worry that fissured the coastal cliffs. It was into this muted world that the two sisters, Elspeth and Prudence, arrived. They came not by sea, as most strangers did, but by a rattling, mud-splattered mail coach that traveled the inland route twice a week. The coachman, a man named Silas, whose face was a roadmap of broken veins, mentioned later that they had been his only passengers for the final 50 miles. He said they had boarded in a town he barely remembered, two silent figures in dark homespun dresses that seemed too thin for the encroaching autumn chill. They carried no grand trunks, only two small, scuffed leather satchels that they kept on their laps for the entire journey. He had tried to engage them in conversation, speaking of the poor fishing season and the early frost, but his words had dissolved into the rattling of the coach wheels. The older one, Elspeth, had offered a single, quiet nod, while the younger, Prudence, had simply stared out at the passing blur of pine and rock, her gaze distant and unreadable. They did not seem like sisters in the conventional sense. There was no idle chatter between them, no shared glances of familiarity. Instead, they existed in a shared, profound silence, a stillness that was more intimidating than any outburst. When the coach finally lurched to a halt in the center of Port Blossom, they disembarked with a fluid, unhurried grace, their boots making almost no sound on the damp earth. The few townsfolk who witnessed their arrival paused their work, their curiosity piqued by the sight of unfamiliar faces. Obadiah, the proprietor of the general store, peered through his grimy window, wiping a clear patch with the heel of his hand. He saw two women standing beside the coach, their forms indistinct in the gray afternoon light. They were tall and spare, with a straightness of posture that seemed to defy the weary slump of the local populace. Their hair was pulled back so tightly that it sharpened the angles of their faces, giving them an almost avian intensity. They did not look around with the wide-eyed confusion of newcomers. Instead, they stood perfectly still for a long moment, as if taking the measure of the town, breathing in its damp, fish-scented air as if it were a rare perfume. Then, as one, they turned their heads toward the row of derelict buildings at the far end of the harbor, where the failed businesses of more optimistic men had been left to the mercy of the wind and tides. It was this shared, deliberate movement that first marked them as something other, a subtle but unnerving synchronicity that the onlookers could not name but felt deep in their bones. Without a word passing between them, the sisters picked up their satchels and began to walk, their dark dresses blending into the encroaching twilight until they seemed to be little more than moving shadows against the weathered gray wood of the abandoned waterfront. They chose the most forsaken of the empty storefronts, a former chandlery whose windows were opaque with years of salt spray and grime. The sign above the door, its letters long since erased by the weather, hung from a single rusted hinge, groaning softly in the wind. The townsfolk watched from a distance as the sisters produced a large iron key and, with a grating screech of metal, forced the swollen wooden door open. They disappeared inside, and for 3 days they were not seen. Light, however, was. A faint, flickering lamplight could be glimpsed through the cleaned lower panes of the windows late into the night, a small, stubborn spark of life in a part of town that had been dark for a decade. The sounds that emanated from within were rhythmic and methodical, the scrape of wood on wood, the splash of water, the steady, percussive thump of a hammer. They were cleaning, repairing, preparing. They asked for no help and sought no conversation. When Prudence finally emerged on the morning of the 4th day, she walked directly to Obadiah's general store. Her entrance caused the small collection of fishermen gathered around the pot-bellied stove to fall silent. She did not browse or hesitate. She approached the counter and, in a voice that was low but clear, requested a list of goods. She asked for flour, salt, onions, carrots, and a large quantity of dried beans. Obadiah, a man not easily flustered, found himself studying her hands as she placed a small worn coin purse on the counter. Her fingers were long and pale, yet her knuckles were red and raw, the skin scrubbed thin from hard labor. It was this small, humanizing detail, the evidence of relentless work, that momentarily softened his appraisal of her. He fulfilled her order, wrapping the goods in brown paper and twine. She paid with coins that were old and smooth, their markings nearly worn away. She gave him a curt, formal nod, gathered the parcels, and left as silently as she had entered. The fishermen waited until the jingle of the bell on the door had faded before resuming their conversation, their voices now hushed and speculative. A week after their arrival, a thin plume of smoke began to rise from the newly repaired chimney of the old chandlery. It was not the acrid, resinous smoke of pine that typically filled the Port Blossom air, but a gentler, more savory scent. It was an aroma that was at once familiar and deeply strange, carrying notes of roasted root vegetables, earthy herbs, and something else, something richer and more complex that no one could quite identify. It was a smell that seemed to possess a physical weight, winding its way through the damp streets, cutting through the fog, and finding its way into the homes and workshops of the town. It was a scent that spoke of warmth, of sustenance, of a hearth long cold being brought back to life. It was an invitation and a mystery, all at once. The following morning, a simple, hand-painted sign appeared on the freshly washed door. It did not announce a grand opening or declare a name for the establishment. It consisted of only 2 words, painted in stark black letters: hot stew. Their first customers were the curious and the desperate. A handful of young fishermen, their stomachs aching with the cold hunger of an early morning on the water, were the first to cross the threshold. They returned to the docks, not with tales of the sisters, who had served them in near total silence, but with descriptions of the stew itself. They said it was unlike any they had ever tasted. It was thick and dark, served in simple earthenware bowls, and filled with chunks of tender, unidentifiable meat and soft, yielding vegetables. But it was the broth that they spoke of with a kind of reverent confusion. They claimed it was more than just savory. It was warming in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was a heat that spread not from the stomach but from the chest, a slow, creeping comfort that seemed to loosen the tight knot of anxiety that lived permanently in the hearts of men who made their living from the sea. They spoke of how the flavors seemed to change with each spoonful, at one moment tasting of the dark, loamy earth of a forest floor, and the next, of something vaguely reminiscent of a forgotten childhood meal. They could not explain it, but they all agreed it was the most satisfying food they had ever eaten. Word traveled quickly in a town as small as Port Blossom. The initial curiosity of the locals began to sharpen into a more focused interest. It was not just the fishermen who began to frequent the small kitchen. Mothers would send their children with tin pails to be filled, hoping the nourishing broth would ward off the lung sickness that so often accompanied the damp winters. Old men, their joints stiff with age and the cold, would sit for hours by the sisters' small fire, cradling their bowls, the steam warming their weathered faces. The sisters, Elspeth and Prudence, remained enigmatic figures at the center of this burgeoning enterprise. They moved about their kitchen with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. Elspeth, the elder, was the one who manned the great black cauldron that was perpetually simmering over the fire. She would stir its contents with a long wooden ladle, her movements slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on the swirling depths of the stew, as if she were reading secrets in the patterns. Prudence was the one who served the customers. She would take their coins without a word, her expression unchanging, and fill their bowls from the cauldron. They never spoke to each other, yet they worked in perfect, unnerving harmony, a silent, seamless collaboration that seemed to have been practiced for a lifetime. Their silence was a vacuum that the townsfolk rushed to fill with their own theories and whispers. Some said they were widows from a far-off city, their fortunes lost. Others speculated they were members of a strange religious sect, performing some kind of penance. The quiet anticipation that had marked their arrival was slowly, bowl by bowl, beginning to transform into something far more complex, a mixture of gratitude, dependence, and a deep, gnawing suspicion about what, precisely, made their stew so unforgettable. The sisters, for their part, offered no answers. They simply continued their work, stirring the pot as the fog rolled in from the sea, their faces illuminated by the fire, two inscrutable keepers of a secret that the town had only just begun to taste. The small kitchen at the edge of the harbor became a strange and vital organ in the body of Port Blossom. It developed its own rhythm, a pulse that beat in time with the simmering of the great black cauldron. Long before the sun had fully risen, a soft orange light would begin to glow in its windows, a warm beacon against the cold, blue pre-dawn. This light, filtered through glass, still dewy with condensation from the steam within, was often the first thing the fishermen saw as they made their way to their boats. It was a sign that the sisters were at their work, their silent ritual already underway. The scent of the stew was now a permanent feature of the waterfront, a rich, savory steam that clung to the air, weaving itself into the familiar smells of brine and wood smoke. It was a fragrance that promised warmth and a unique, inexplicable solace, and it drew the townsfolk in with a power that none of them could fully comprehend or articulate. Inside, the atmosphere was thick and hushed. The air was heavy with moisture, and the rough-hewn wooden walls seemed to sweat in the constant, fragrant heat. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the gentle bubbling of the stew, and the scrape of Prudence's ladle against the bottom of an earthenware bowl. The sisters themselves remained a profound mystery, two silent figures moving with a ghostly efficiency within their steamy domain. They seemed to require no communication, their actions flowing one into the next as if guided by a single, shared mind. Their silence was not empty. It was a heavy, watchful presence that discouraged conversation and turned the simple act of eating a meal into a deeply personal, almost clandestine experience. The customers who came and went from that small, warm room began to carry stories away with them, stories that were shared in hushed tones over mending nets or beside flickering hearths. These were not simple declarations of a good meal. They were fragmented, confused accounts of the stew's unsettling effects. Josiah, a fisherman whose hands were calloused into leather pads and whose face was a mask of stoic indifference, carved by years of wind and loss, was one of the first to put a name to the stew's strange power. He had gone to the kitchen one morning, chilled to the bone after a night of poor fishing, seeking only to drive the cold from his limbs. As he ate, spooning the thick, dark liquid into his mouth, he felt the familiar warmth spread through his belly. But then came something else. A profound and unexpected wave of grief washed over him, so potent that it made his throat tighten and his eyes burn. It was a sorrow he recognized but had not felt with such intensity for over a decade, not since the day he had buried his firstborn son, a boy taken by a fever in the dead of winter. He said later, his voice low and strained as he spoke to his wife, that it was not just a feeling. For a fleeting moment, he had smelled the sharp, medicinal scent of the poultice they had used to treat the boy's chest, a smell he had consciously avoided for 10 years. He told her that the stew had not created the memory, but had found it, as if it had reached inside him and pulled a splinter from his soul. He was a man who prided himself on his emotional fortitude, and this involuntary vulnerability left him deeply shaken. He did not know if the experience had been a comfort or a violation. The rumors began to shift from the stew's effect on the present to its power over the past. It was Hephzibah, an elderly widow who had not been heard to speak more than 3 consecutive words since her husband's death at sea 20 years prior, who became the focal point of this new strain of whispers. Her life had shrunk to the 4 walls of her small cottage and the well-worn path to the churchyard, where her husband, Amos, was memorialized by a stone that watched over an empty plot. Driven by a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, she made her way to the sisters' kitchen, her shawl pulled tight around her bony shoulders. She ate the stew slowly, her rheumy eyes half closed. The townsfolk who were present said that a gradual, remarkable change came over her. The deep, sorrowful lines on her face seemed to soften, and a faint flush of color crept into her papery cheeks. When she finished, she left without a word, but she returned the next day, and the day after that, she became their most devoted customer. It was her neighbor, Martha, who first noticed the true strangeness of Hephzibah's transformation. Martha recounted how she had heard Hephzibah humming an old sea shanty, a tune Amos had been fond of singing. Then, one afternoon, Martha found her sitting on her porch, staring out at the harbor, a faint, wistful smile on her face. Martha had asked if she was feeling well. Hephzibah had turned to her, her eyes clear and strangely bright, and had spoken of the first time Amos had brought her a gull's feather, placing it in her hair when they were just courting. She spoke of the memory not as a distant recollection, but as a fresh and present joy. She said the stew helped her remember the feeling of the sea breeze on her skin that day, the exact shade of blue of his eyes. The stew, for Hephzibah, was not food. It was a form of communion. It did not bring her husband back, but it returned her to him, allowing her to walk through the sunlit corridors of her memory. The whispers that followed this revelation were tinged with awe and a creeping dread. To be able to relive one's happiest moments was a seductive, intoxicating idea. But to be so consumed by the past, to prefer its ghosts to the company of the living, seemed a dangerous and unnatural bargain. The stew's reputation as a restorative for the soul was soon overshadowed by a more dramatic and tangible claim, that it could heal the body. This notion attached itself to the figure of Phineas, a man who had been slowly wasting away for 2 years from a persistent affliction of the lungs. His cough was a familiar sound in the town, a dry, rattling harbinger of his slow decline. His skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and his work as a cooper had dwindled to almost nothing, his strength failing him. He had spent what little money he had on tinctures from a traveling doctor, foul-smelling liquids that did nothing to halt his inexorable fade. It was his wife, in a final act of desperation, who brought him a pail of the sisters' stew. Phineas was skeptical. He had no appetite, and saw little point in eating what he believed was simply a well-seasoned pottage. But to appease his wife, he consumed a small bowl. He admitted that it was savory and warming, but he expected nothing more. He ate it again the next day, and the day after. By the end of the week, a noticeable change had occurred. The relentless, hacking cough that had been his constant companion began to subside, replaced by a less frequent, less violent spasm. The deep, hollow circles under his eyes seemed to lighten. After 2 weeks of a daily regimen of the stew, Phineas was seen walking down to the docks, not with his usual slow, pained shuffle, but with a firm and steady stride. He spoke to the blacksmith, a man named Ezra, his voice lacking its familiar wheezing undertone. He explained that he felt a warmth in his chest that had displaced the cold, tight knot of his illness. He said he had woken up that morning and taken a deep breath without pain, for the first time in years. He did not call it a miracle. Phineas was a pragmatic man. He simply stated, with the quiet conviction of one who has experienced the impossible, that the sisters' stew had given him back his life. This story, more than any other, cemented the sisters' legend. The news of Phineas's recovery spread through Port Blossom like wildfire. The stew was no longer just a curiosity or a comfort. It was now perceived as a potent form of medicine, a cure for ailments that the town's doctor and God himself had seemed unable to touch. The dim glow of the lanterns in the kitchen window became a beacon of hope for the sick and the grieving. People began to line up outside the door in the mornings, their faces a mixture of desperation and awe. They came seeking not just a meal, but a remedy. A woman with crippling pains in her joints claimed she could walk freely after a week of eating the stew. A man suffering from melancholic humors spoke of a lifting of the great weight from his spirit. Each new testimony added another layer to the growing myth of the 2 silent sisters and their magical cauldron. But with this fame came a new and insidious undercurrent of unease. The stew's power was undeniable, but its nature was a troubling enigma. It was not food as they understood it. It was not medicine as they knew it. It healed the body, resurrected memories, and soothed the soul. Such power felt unnatural, its source a terrifying and compelling mystery. The question whispered in the general store and in the quiet of the church pews was no longer about the stew's ingredients. The townsfolk now asked a much more dangerous question. Was this a gift of Providence, or was it the product of a darker, more ancient craft? The admiration that had greeted the sisters was slowly curdling into fear. The strange nourishment they provided was becoming a source of deep and unsettling suspicion, and their growing legend was beginning to cast a long, menacing shadow over the town of Port Blossom. The gratitude that had blossomed in Port Blossom was a fragile, short-lived flower. As the days shortened and the autumn air grew a sharper edge, the roots of this gratitude began to rot in a soil of deep-seated fear. The stew, once a symbol of inexplicable comfort, was now becoming a source of communal anxiety. The very power that had drawn the townsfolk to the sisters' door now caused them to recoil. Miracles that could not be understood were difficult to distinguish from curses, and the inexplicable nature of the sisters' gift began to feel less like a blessing and more like a transgression. The town's collective mood began to curdle, and the epicenter of this transformation was the one place designed to offer sanctuary and certainty: the stark, white-steepled chapel that stood on a low hill overlooking the harbor, its spire a perpetually admonishing finger pointed at the heavens. The shepherd of this particular flock was the Reverend Theron, a man whose piety was as unyielding and severe as the granite coastline. He was a tall, gaunt figure, his body seemingly composed of sharp angles and rigid lines, all of it cloaked in unrelenting black. His face was narrow, dominated by eyes that were the pale, cold gray of a winter sea, and they seemed to see not the people before him, but the state of their immortal souls, which he almost invariably found wanting. His sermons had always been concerned with the fires of damnation and the insidious nature of temptation, but in the weeks following Phineas's recovery, his words took on a new, pointed urgency. He never mentioned the sisters by name. He was too shrewd for such a direct accusation. Instead, he spoke in parables of his own devising, his voice a dry rustle that filled the cold, unadorned chapel. He warned his congregation about false prophets and deceptive cures. He posed questions that hung in the air long after the amens had faded. He asked them where true healing came from. He reminded them that the Lord worked in ways that were righteous and clear, through prayer and penance, not through the mysterious contents of a common stew pot. He spoke of the danger of seeking earthly remedies for spiritual afflictions, suggesting that such relief was often a snare, a temporary comfort offered by the adversary to lure souls away from the path of true salvation. He told them that any power that did not originate from God must, by its very nature, originate from his opposite. His words were seeds of doubt planted in the fertile ground of their inherent superstition. The congregation would leave the chapel in silence, the reverend's questions echoing in their minds, and they would look down at the harbor, where the thin plume of smoke rose from the sisters' chimney, and they would see not a promise of warmth, but the foul exhaust of a hidden, unholy fire. The effect of the reverend's rhetoric was slow but inexorable. It began with a quiet but deliberate avoidance. The small, worn path leading to the sisters' kitchen, once trodden daily by dozens of boots, began to see less traffic. Men who had praised the stew's restorative powers now claimed it left a strange, metallic aftertaste in their mouths. They began to invent excuses. A fisherman would say his wife had packed him salt fish for the day. A dock worker would claim he had lost his appetite. These were small, individual acts of retreat, but they formed a collective turning of the town's back. Obadiah, from behind the counter of his general store, became an unwitting chronicler of this shift. He noted that Prudence's visits were becoming less frequent. Her requests for onions, carrots, and beans had dwindled. She still came, her expression as impassive as ever, but she now bought only what was needed for a much smaller clientele. The conversations in the store had also changed. The awe-filled whispers about the stew's magic had been replaced by darker speculations. Some now claimed that the memories the stew brought back were not a gift, but a form of bondage, trapping the eater in the past and making them unfit for the duties of the present. They pointed to Hephzibah, the widow, as proof. She was no longer seen as a woman comforted by her memories, but as one haunted by them, a soul lost in a waking dream, her earthly purpose abandoned. They whispered that the stew did not heal, but merely masked the sickness, driving it deeper into the body where it could fester in the dark. Fear, it turned out, was a far more powerful contagion than any lung affliction. The simmering paranoia required a spark to ignite into open accusation, and that spark was provided by a child. Her name was Lydia, a girl of 7 years, with wide, curious eyes and a quiet disposition. Her mother, a devout woman named Agnes, who took the Reverend's every word as gospel, had been one of the first to forbid her family from partaking of the stew. But Lydia, like many children in Port Blossom, was frail, afflicted by a persistent, low-grade fever that left her pale and listless. One afternoon, while Agnes was at the market, the child's grandmother, a woman who clung to the old ways and had more faith in poultices than in prayers, took it upon herself to intervene. She took a small tin pail, and her heart a mixture of hope and trepidation, procured a serving of the sisters' stew. She fed it to Lydia by the spoonful, believing that a little warmth and nourishment could do no harm. The child ate it without complaint. That evening, the fever broke, but what replaced it was something far more terrifying to her mother. Agnes found Lydia sitting bolt upright in her small bed, her eyes wide open but seeing something far beyond the familiar walls of her room. The child was speaking, not in her usual soft, childish tones, but in a strange, declarative voice that seemed too old and too weary for her small frame. Agnes listened, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Lydia was describing things a 7-year-old girl from a remote Maine fishing village could not possibly know. She spoke of a land without trees, under a sun that was a merciless white fire. She described strange, triangular mountains of stone that pierced a cloudless sky. She spoke of a great river, as wide as the sea, that was the color of blood, and of boats with sails like the wings of a hawk. She spoke of gods with the heads of animals and of rituals performed in chambers deep beneath the earth, where the air was still and smelled of dust and forgotten spices. It was a torrent of alien imagery, a vision of a world that was ancient and pagan, utterly divorced from the cold, gray, Christian reality of Port Blossom. Agnes grabbed her daughter, shaking her, but the child seemed not to notice, her gaze fixed on the unseen desert landscape that had superimposed itself upon her bedroom. When the vision finally faded, Lydia collapsed back onto her pillow, falling into a deep, exhausted sleep, leaving her mother alone in the terrifying silence, the child's strange words echoing in the room. Agnes, frantic with a fear she could only interpret as righteous terror, ran from her house and did not stop until she reached the Reverend Theron's door. There, her words tumbling over one another in a frantic, whispered confession, she told him what had happened. She told him of the grandmother's transgression, of the stew, and of the unholy visions that had poured from her daughter's mouth. The Reverend listened patiently, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression grim but unsurprised. He saw this not as the rambling of a feverish child, but as definitive proof of his warnings. This was not a memory the stew had unlocked. This was something else entirely. It was an intrusion, a foreign spirit speaking through the vessel of an innocent child. The visions were not of a lost loved one or a happy moment from the past. They were of a heathen land, a place of false idols and ancient, ungodly power. To him, the conclusion was inescapable. The sisters were not merely peddling a strange brew. They were conduits for a corrupting influence. The stew was not just food. It was a sacrament of a dark and ancient faith, and with every bowl they served, they were poisoning the souls of his flock. The heavy silence of the churchyard that dusk felt different. It was no longer a silence of peace or contemplation. It was the heavy, charged silence that precedes a storm. Fear had found its justification. Suspicion now had its proof. The whispers of curses and witchcraft were no longer confined to the shadows. They were about to be given a voice, and the sisters, whether they knew it or not, now stood formally and irrevocably accused. The transition from admiration to fear was complete. Now, fear was about to transform into action. The Reverend Theron did not let Agnes's terrified testimony fester in private. He acted with the swift and decisive certainty of a man who believed he was an instrument of divine will. The very next evening, as a sliver of a moon hung like a sickle in the bruised twilight sky, the chapel bell began to toll. It was not the gentle, rhythmic chime that called the faithful to Sunday service. This was a different sound, a frantic, clanging peal that was urgent and insistent, a sound usually reserved for warnings of a ship foundering on the rocks or a fire sweeping through the tightly packed wooden houses. It was an alarm, a summons that cut through the evening calm and brought the people of Port Blossom out of their homes, their faces etched with alarm and confusion. They moved through the darkening streets, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows, their footsteps a muted, shuffling procession on the damp earth, all converging on the small hill where the chapel stood, its windows blazing with a stark, intimidating light. The building, usually a place of quiet reflection, now felt like a courtroom, a place of judgment. The interior of the chapel was a study in harsh contrasts. The flickering light from dozens of tallow candles and oil lamps threw the faces of the gathered townsfolk into sharp relief, carving deep shadows into the hollows of their cheeks and eyes. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, hot wax, and the collective, anxious breath of nearly the entire adult population. They packed the simple wooden pews, men on one side, women on the other, their bodies pressed close together in a solidarity born not of fellowship, but of a shared, burgeoning fear. There was no quiet murmuring, no exchange of pleasantries. A heavy, expectant silence filled the room, broken only by the occasional nervous cough or the creak of a wooden board under shifting weight. The Reverend Theron stood at the pulpit, a severe black silhouette against the stark white wall behind him. His face was a pale, unreadable mask, his hands resting on the worn leather of his Bible. He did not need to raise his voice to command their attention. The weight of their fear did that for him. He let the silence stretch, allowing the tension to build until it was a palpable presence in the room, a taut wire humming with dread. He had orchestrated this gathering with a keen understanding of mob psychology, transforming his chapel from a house of prayer into an arena where collective paranoia could be focused and given a target. Into this charged atmosphere, the sisters walked. They had not been summoned by the bell in the same way as the others. A delegation of 3 men, led by Ezra the blacksmith, a man whose physical strength was matched only by his spiritual certainty, had been dispatched to their small kitchen. They had delivered the Reverend's summons not as a request, but as a command. The townsfolk in the chapel turned as one when the heavy doors creaked open, their heads swiveling with a synchronized, predatory movement. Elspeth and Prudence entered, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft whisper of their dark dresses against the rough-hewn floorboards. They did not appear intimidated or surprised. They moved with the same deliberate, unhurried grace that had marked their arrival in the town months before. They walked down the central aisle, their gazes straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to the dozens of hostile eyes that followed their every step. They did not look like witches from a storybook. There were no gnarled hands or malevolent glares. They were simply 2 women, their faces pale and composed in the flickering candlelight, their expressions unreadable, but their calmness, their refusal to display any sign of fear or guilt, was in itself an indictment. It was an unnerving, alien stillness that set them apart from the agitated energy of the crowd, and it was interpreted not as innocence, but as a sign of an unnatural and profound detachment from the world of ordinary human emotion. They did not take a seat in the pews. Instead, they stopped at the front of the chapel, turning to face the congregation, positioning themselves directly below the pulpit. It was a subtle act of defiance, placing themselves not among the accused, but as equals, ready to receive the town's judgment. And between them, they carried the source of their power and the object of the town's fear, the great black cauldron. It was still warm, a faint wisp of steam curling from its unseen contents. They placed it carefully on the floor, the iron legs scraping softly against the wood. The faint, savory aroma of the stew began to permeate the chapel, a scent that had once been a comfort but was now an offense, a fragrant specter of the very influence they had all gathered to condemn. The Reverend Theron watched them, his thin lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line. He let the silent tableau hold for a long, dramatic moment. The two silent women, their mysterious pot, and the fearful, angry congregation. Then he began to speak. His voice, at first, was low and measured, the voice of a man presenting a logical and irrefutable case. He spoke of the town's initial gratitude, of the hope that the sisters had brought. He acknowledged the recovery of Phineas and the comfort brought to the widow Hephzibah. But then his tone began to shift, the edges of his words sharpening, his cadence taking on the rhythmic, accusatory beat of a litany of sins. He moved from gratitude to the unnaturalness of it all. He asked the assembled crowd what they truly knew of these women. He asked from where they had come, and by what authority they performed their strange works. His questions became rhetorical weapons, each one designed to stoke the embers of their suspicion. Then, his voice rising in volume and intensity, he brought forth his star witness. He called Agnes to her feet. The woman rose, trembling, and in a choked, fearful voice, she recounted the story of her daughter's visions, of the heathen lands and animal-headed gods. As she spoke, a low murmur rippled through the congregation, a sound of collective horror and validation. The story, now told in the sanctified space of the chapel, took on the weight of absolute truth. The child's fever dream was transformed into a demonic possession. The murmur grew into a chorus of rising voices. The dam of restrained fear broke, and a flood of accusations filled the chapel. One man shouted that his brother, once a devoted customer of the sisters, had begun to neglect his work, preferring to sit by the fire and stare into the flames, lost in the stew-induced memories of his youth. Another woman cried out that the stew had soured the milk from her best cow. Every misfortune, every piece of bad luck from the past few months was now laid at the sisters' door. The stew was blamed for the poor fishing, for the early frost, for the sickness of a child and the melancholy of a man. The accusations grew wilder, more unhinged, fueled by the mob's escalating hysteria. The flickering candlelight in the drafty wooden chapel made the scene seem phantasmagorical, the shadows on the walls twisting and leaping like demons at a Sabbath. The faces of the townsfolk were distorted with a righteous fury, their fear having found its outlet in a shared, unifying hatred. Throughout this rising crescendo of accusation and condemnation, Elspeth and Prudence remained perfectly still. They did not speak, they did not flinch. They simply stood beside their cauldron, their faces impassive, their eyes moving calmly over the contorted faces of the crowd. Their silence was their only defense, and it was a powerful one. It enraged the accusers further, their inability to provoke a reaction, to see a flicker of fear or guilt, driving them to a new peak of frenzy. The Reverend Theron, his purpose achieved, raised his hands for silence. The cacophony slowly subsided, leaving a ringing, hate-filled quiet. He pointed a long, bony finger at the two women. He demanded that they confess the source of their power. He demanded that they renounce the evil they had brought into this godly town. He demanded that they name their master. It was Elspeth, the elder sister, who finally moved. She did not look at the reverend. Her gaze was fixed on the faces in the pews, on the people she had fed. She bent down slowly, and with a steady hand, lifted the heavy lid from the cauldron. A thick, fragrant cloud of steam billowed out, filling the front of the chapel with the rich, complex aroma that had once so captivated them. Then she straightened up, a large wooden ladle in her hand. Prudence, moving with the same fluid, synchronized grace, produced a stack of simple earthenware bowls. They did not confess. They did not defend themselves. They did not defy the reverend with words. Their response was an act. In the face of judgment, surrounded by a town that was ready to condemn them, they began to serve one final pot of stew. It was an act of profound and unsettling defiance, a ritual that transcended the chaos of the moment, turning the night of reckoning into a strange and sacred ceremony of their own making. The act of serving the stew in the face of the town's collective fury was so audacious, so contrary to any expected response, that it momentarily shattered the mob's momentum. The enraged shouts died in their throats, replaced by a wave of stunned, confused silence. The townsfolk stared, their anger faltering, caught off guard by this quiet, inexplicable ritual. Elspeth and Prudence moved with the serene, focused calm of priests administering a sacrament. Elspeth would dip the ladle into the steaming cauldron, her movements fluid and economical, and pour the dark, thick liquid into a bowl. Prudence would then take the offered vessel and, without a word, step towards the pews. The atmosphere in the chapel had transformed from one of impending violence to one of thick, ritualistic tension. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, charged with a power that was older and more profound than the reverend's righteous indignation. The flickering candlelight cast the sisters' shadows long and sharp against the walls, making them seem like hieratic figures from some forgotten, ancient rite. Prudence offered the first bowl to Ezra, the blacksmith, a man whose physical presence was a bulwark of the town's outrage. He was seated at the end of the first pew, his face a thunderous mask of condemnation. He recoiled as if the bowl were filled with hot coals, his large hands clenched into fists on his knees. He shook his head violently, a low growl rumbling in his chest, a clear and vehement refusal. Undeterred, Prudence simply turned and offered the same bowl to the man sitting next to him, a fisherman named Malachi. Malachi hesitated. His eyes darted from the steaming bowl to the stern, disapproving face of the Reverend Theron, then to the hostile faces of his neighbors. A war was being fought within him, a battle between fear and a deep, remembered comfort. The aroma of the stew, so rich and evocative, was a powerful persuasion. With a trembling hand, he reached out and took the bowl. He did not eat, not yet, but he held it in his lap, the warmth seeping through the earthenware into his cold fingers. This small act of acceptance broke the spell of unified refusal. Prudence moved silently down the aisle, offering the stew. Some, the most devout followers of the Reverend, the most fearful and superstitious, shrank away, crossing their arms over their chests, as if to ward off a palpable evil. But others, perhaps a third of the congregation, found themselves unable to resist. They were the ones who had felt the stew's power most keenly, the grieving, the sick, the weary. They accepted the bowls with a kind of furtive desperation, their eyes downcast, as if ashamed of their own need. The Reverend Theron watched this silent schism with a growing sense of impotent fury. He had brought his flock to the brink of judgment, only to see them seduced once more by the very object of his condemnation. He thundered from the pulpit, his voice cracking with rage. He called them fools and backsliders. He warned them that they were partaking not in a meal, but in a damnable communion. He told them that every spoonful was a pact with the darkness, a willing invitation for corruption to enter their souls, but his words seemed to have lost their power. They washed over the silent, divided congregation, unable to compete with the tangible, fragrant reality of the stew. Those who had accepted the bowls began to eat. They lifted the wooden spoons to their lips with a slow, deliberate motion, their actions imbued with a strange, solemn gravity. And as they ate, a profound and visible change began to come over them. It was not a sudden, dramatic transformation. It was a slow, internal unfolding, an experience that registered on their faces as a cascade of subtle, deeply personal emotions. A man named Silas, who had lost his wife to the sea 5 years prior, let his spoon clatter to the floor. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, but his face was not contorted with grief. Instead, he wore an expression of incredulous, heartbreaking joy. He whispered a name, Abigail, his voice thick with a wonder that silenced those around him. He later claimed that he had not seen his wife's face, but had felt, with an absolute and unshakable certainty, the sensation of her hand resting on his shoulder, a familiar, comforting weight he had thought lost to him forever. Across the aisle, a woman named Temperance, known for her sharp tongue and a bitterness that had encrusted her spirit since a youthful betrayal, suddenly let out a soft, shuddering sob. Those near her heard her murmur that she was sorry, over and over again. She would later confess to her sister that she had been forced to witness the moment of her own cruelty, to see the pain in the eyes of the friend she had wronged, and that the vision had washed her clean with a shame so profound it felt like a baptism. The visions were not all of comfort or contrition. Some were terrifying. A merchant, a man known for his sharp dealings and quiet avarice, slumped forward in his pew, his face pale and slick with sweat. He began to make small, mewling sounds, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed directed inward. He spoke of a ledger, of pages filled with names he had cheated, the numbers glowing like embers. He saw not the faces of his ancestors, but the faces of his sins, a silent, accusing jury that had risen from the depths of his own conscience. Each person who ate from the cauldron was experiencing a reckoning, a final, concentrated dose of the stew's power. It was no longer just bringing back simple memories. It was forcing a confrontation with the defining moments of their lives, the moments of greatest love, deepest shame, and most profound loss. They were seeing lost loves, yes, but they were also seeing their own failings, their forgotten cruelties, the ghosts of choices they had made and roads they had not taken. The stew had become a mirror, reflecting not their faces, but the unvarnished, unadorned truth of their souls. The chapel was filled with the sounds of this collective involuntary confession. Soft weeping, whispered names, sharp intakes of breath, the low moans of both sorrow and ecstasy. It was as if the sisters had uncorked the secret, repressed heart of the entire town, letting all of its hidden griefs and shames and joys spill out into the sanctified air. Those who had refused the stew watched this spectacle with a mixture of horror and a strange, resentful envy. They were safe from the visions, their souls unexamined, but they were also excluded from the profound, transformative experience that was unfolding before their eyes. They clutched their Bibles and their self-righteousness, but they could not deny the authenticity of the emotions they were witnessing. They were outside a mystery to which they had not been given the key, and their fear began to mingle with the unsettling feeling that they had refused not a poison, but a profound and terrible grace. Throughout it all, Elspeth and Prudence stood by their empty cauldron, their work now done. They watched the faces of the eaters, their expressions still and unreadable, like artists observing the full, staggering effect of their creation. They seemed neither pleased nor surprised, only present. The visions, for each person, lasted only a few minutes, but they were so intense as to feel like a lifetime. As the last of the eaters returned to themselves, a deep, exhausted silence fell over the chapel. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and unnerving calm. The accusers had been silenced, their rage supplanted by a confusing mix of awe and terror. The accused had offered their final, irrefutable testimony, a defense delivered not in words, but in the raw, undeniable language of the human heart. The Reverend Theron stood frozen in his pulpit, his mouth slightly agape, a man whose simple narrative of good and evil had been utterly shattered by a truth that was far more complex and terrifying. In the stunned silence, as the last wisp of steam faded from the lip of the cauldron, Elspeth and Prudence turned. They picked up their empty pot, one sister on each handle, and with the same silent, deliberate grace with which they had entered, they walked back down the aisle and out of the heavy chapel doors, leaving the town of Port Blossom to grapple with the ghosts they had just been forced to confront. The next morning, as the first pale, gray light of dawn touched the harbor, a small group of townsfolk, led by a humbled and confused Ezra, made their way to the sisters' kitchen. They did not know what they intended to do, whether to apologize, to ask for forgiveness, or simply to understand. But when they arrived, they found the door slightly ajar, creaking softly in the morning breeze. They pushed it open and stepped inside. The kitchen was empty. It was not just empty of people, it was devoid of any sign of their recent, intense occupation. The great black cauldron was gone. The shelves, once stocked with dried beans and roots, were bare. The simple cots in the back room were stripped, the thin blankets folded neatly at their base. The only thing that remained was the faintest, lingering scent of the stew, a ghost of a fragrance in the cool morning air. The fire in the hearth was cold, a bed of gray, feathery ash. The sisters had disappeared. They had vanished as silently and mysteriously as they had arrived, melting back into the fog-shrouded landscape from which they had emerged, leaving behind only an empty kitchen and a town that would be forever changed by the memory of their last, unsettling supper. The question of whether they had simply left, or whether they had been taken by some force, celestial or otherwise, was a question that would hang over Port Blossom, unanswered, for generations to come. The morning that followed the sisters' disappearance dawned cold and unnervingly quiet. The town of Port Blossom awoke to a profound and collective emotional hangover, the raw, spiritual intensity of the previous night having receded into a state of weary, bewildered silence. The townsfolk moved through their morning routines with a leaden slowness, their eyes avoiding those of their neighbors. A chasm had opened in the chapel, a stark dividing line between those who had partaken of the final stew and those who had refused. There was no open hostility between the two factions, but there was a new and uncomfortable awareness, a shared memory of a moment when the private, interior lives of a third of the population had been laid bare for all to see. Those who had eaten now carried a fragile, altered look in their eyes, the look of people who had been forced to gaze upon a truth too vast for the small containers of their daily lives. Those who had abstained watched them with a mixture of suspicion, pity, and a deeply buried, resentful curiosity. They were the ones left standing on the shore, wondering at the secrets of the deep that the others had been forced to plunge into. The Reverend Theron was a broken man. He conducted the following Sunday service, his voice a dry, hollow rasp, his words stripped of their former fire and certainty. He spoke of forgiveness and mystery, but the conviction had gone out of him. His simple, stark worldview of a world locked in a struggle between a benevolent God and a cunning devil had been irrevocably complicated. He had witnessed a power that was neither clearly divine nor definitively demonic, a force that had healed and tormented in the same breath, that had used truth as its medium and memory as its vessel. He had no name for what he had seen, no chapter or verse to contain it, and this doctrinal void seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. He would continue to preach for another 5 years, but his sermons became rambling, philosophical explorations that left his congregation more confused than edified. He eventually retired, a man defeated not by a tangible enemy, but by the sheer, unyielding weight of an unanswered question. His failure to categorize the sisters' power became his life's great, silent shame. In the years that followed, the story of that night in the chapel became the town's defining secret, a communal trauma that was rarely spoken of directly, but which informed every aspect of their lives. The debate over what had actually happened was never a public forum. It took place in quiet kitchens and on lonely stretches of the shore, in hushed tones between husbands and wives, parents and children. The theories were as varied as the people who held them. Some, like Phineas, who lived to a ripe old age, his lungs clear and strong to the end, maintained that the sisters had been benevolent, if strange, healers. He argued that their stew was a form of medicine unknown to the modern world, perhaps a recipe of herbs and roots passed down through generations. He believed the visions were merely a side effect, a fever dream brought on by the potent, curative properties of the broth. He spoke of the sisters with a quiet, unwavering gratitude, dismissing the fears of his neighbors as the predictable outcry of ignorance in the face of the unknown. Others held to a darker interpretation. They whispered that the sisters had been practitioners of an ancient and subtle form of witchcraft. They argued that the stew's power came not from what was added, but from what was taken. They believed the sisters had possessed the ability to draw out the most potent memories from a person and distill their essence into the broth. Each customer, they claimed, was consuming the concentrated joy or sorrow of the person who had been served before them. The stew, in this telling, was a vessel of shared souls, a constant, roiling soup of the town's collective emotional history. This theory was particularly popular among those who had refused the final serving, as it painted the eaters as victims of a spiritual violation, their innermost selves plundered for some arcane purpose. It was a terrifying thought that the comfort they had witnessed had been fueled by the very substance of their neighbors' lives, a form of unwilling, emotional cannibalism. The most persistent and haunting legacy of the sisters was not in the debates or the theories, but in the dreams of those who had eaten the stew. The experience was not universal, but it was common enough to become a recognized phenomenon within the community. Men and women would speak of waking in the dead of night with a phantom taste on their tongues, the rich, savory, and deeply complex flavor of the stew, as real and present as if they had just taken a spoonful. For some, the taste was a comfort, a fleeting reminder of a loved one's touch, or a moment of profound peace that the final vision had granted them. For Silas, the widower, the dream taste was a bittersweet communion, a sign that the memory of his wife was still a living presence within him. But for others, the ghostly flavor was a harbinger of dread. The merchant who had seen his ledger of sins would wake from nightmares of his own devising, the taste of the stew in his mouth, a sure sign that he had spent the night being judged once again by the specters of his own greed. These nocturnal visitations ensured that the sisters' influence never truly faded. Their recipe had been consumed, but it was not gone. It had become a part of the people themselves, a dormant seed planted in their souls that would unexpectedly blossom in the darkness, a reminder that what they had ingested was never just food. The abandoned kitchen at the edge of the harbor became a physical monument to the town's unresolved memory. For the first few years, no one dared to touch it. It stood silent and empty, the hand-painted sign fading and peeling in the harsh coastal weather. Children would dare each other to run up and touch the door, but none would linger, claiming that the air around the small building was always colder, and that if you pressed your ear to the weathered wood, you could hear the faint, ghostly sound of a liquid slowly simmering. As the years turned into decades, the structure began to surrender to the slow, relentless siege of nature. The roof sagged and then collapsed under the weight of heavy winter snows. Wild, thorny roses, the color of dried blood, grew up through the floorboards, their vines coiling around the decaying doorframe like grasping fingers. The salt-laced wind scoured the wooden walls, stripping them of their last vestiges of paint, bleaching them to the color of bone. The building was no longer a kitchen. It was a skeleton, a ruin that was slowly being reabsorbed by the land. It became a place of folklore, a landmark in the ghost stories that the old fishermen would tell to the wide-eyed children of the town, a tangible reminder of the two strange women who had come from nowhere and had vanished just as completely, leaving behind nothing but a legend and a lingering, unanswerable question. Ultimately, the names Elspeth and Prudence were lost to time, eroded by the passing years just as the sign above their door had been. They became known simply as the Sisters, or sometimes, by those of a more dramatic bent, the Stew Witches of Port Blossom. Their story became the town's great myth, a tale that was both a boast and a warning. It was a boast about the town's unique and mysterious past, a story that set it apart from the other drab fishing villages that dotted the coast. And it was a warning, a cautionary tale about the danger of accepting gifts that cannot be understood, about the seductive power of memory, and about the fine, almost invisible line that separates healing from corruption. The core question, the one that had been whispered in the chapel and debated for generations, was never answered. What did the sisters really put in the stew? Was it rare herbs, a lost art of healing, or was it something more, something ineffable and arcane? Was the secret ingredient a plant, a mineral, a spell, or was it simply the profound, unadulterated truth of the human heart, served up in a bowl? The question lingered in the air, as inseparable from the identity of Port Blossom as the fog that rolled in from the sea. The sisters had offered a stew that wasn't just food, it was a mirror, and the town, having looked into it once, would spend the rest of its days haunted by its own reflection, forever bound together by the legacy of a meal that fed their bodies, but devoured their certainty. The record on the Sisters of Port Blossom is now complete. We are grateful for your silent witness as we've turned these final, faded pages. If you have only just discovered this archive and wish to be present when the next file is unsealed, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive and share your own thoughts on the nature of the stew in the comments below.